Good afternoon. My name is Peter Dahlin. I'm the Managing Director of the American Chamber of Commerce in Sweden, and we're thrilled to be co-hosting this important initiative together with the Swedish Institute Against Corruption and Transparency International Sweden. We've been working all year to get this done, and I know you guys want to get right to the substance. So I'm going to make a very brief introduction of our moderator. For most of you, he likely needs no introduction because Fredrik Versal has had a long and distinguished career in public service in Sweden. He currently serves as the president of the Svea Court of Appeals and as the chairman of the board of the Swedish Anti-Corruption Institute, which is one of our co-hosts here today. And in the interests of full disclosure and transparency, as is the spirit of the day, he's also my wife's cousin.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
Fredrik, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really enjoy this opportunity to see also relatives. We're going to have a seminar here in this hot climate room. Namely, the positive work against corruption seen from Swedish and American perspectives. And I'm very happy to introduce to you two very distinguished speakers on this subject with a high profile, not only in general policy issues, but also in specifically, or particularly in this area. Namely, our Minister of Justice, Morgan Johansson. He has for a long time been involved in justice policy issues, not only as a minister, but also as a spokesperson for the Social Democratic Party and also chairman of the Justice Committee of the Parliament. And U.S. Ambassador to Stockholm, Mark Brzezinski, this is your last days here?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
I'll be departing Sweden July 6th, and so this is a bittersweet moment. This is my fourth Almedalen, my fourth visit to Visby, and I love engaging such a topic that, to me, binds America and Sweden together, and that's the global fight against corruption.
And I understood that you have a history also as a lawyer in dealing with the questions concerning corruption and things like that.
I do. I'm a political appointee as an ambassador here in Sweden. And before I was appointed by President Obama to come to Sweden, I was an attorney in Washington, and I counseled companies specifically on compliance with the American law prohibiting bribery, which is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is something that we have seen as an area of business just blossom because of the amount of enforcement that there is of it now in comparison to even the recent past.
Well, our idea with this discussion is to at least initially focus on international perspective from a Swedish and American point of view. How could we create an even play field for our companies on an international market, not at least in relation to the public sector in different countries? We should discuss legal infrastructure on an international level and the implementation of a legal infrastructure, question on jurisdictions, and also questions of creating common values and the development of the view on corruption over the years. Also, the importance of prevention and self-regulating mechanisms. And if we got time, we hopefully could touch upon a number of domestic issues in the legal field that I know that our minister is very interested in. So my first question is to you, Ambassador. Sweden ranks quite high when it comes to anti-corruption on an international scale. In the back mirror, over these years that you have learned to know the Swedish society, as a starting point, is this high ranking of Sweden in line with your impressions of this society?
Well, the ranking is not just based on impressions. It's really Transparency International does an annual rigorous study. It's called the Corruption Perceptions Index, which looks at a whole host of factors pertaining to way a companies pertaining to the way a country's companies does business around the world. And the amount of focus that is put into developing compliance programs, the rigorousness with which they vet consultants, service providers in countries around the world, including those that unfortunately have reputations for corruption. And it's been my experience in almost 4 years in Sweden, and I have visited the four corners of Sweden, from Jokkmokk to the north to Malmö in the south, east and west. I have found that when it comes to Swedish companies that I have spent time with, large and small, new and old industries and the new IT companies that are taking connective technology by storm, I have found a seriousness of purpose in thinking through with whom they do business, where they do business, and what are firewalls they can set up to prevent events of corruption. Not only is that the morally right thing to do, it's also good business, because I come from a country, I'm the United States, I'm an ambassador from a country, the United States, that in the last 5 years has undertaken a global war against bribery. And today in America, there are now more foreign companies under investigation for violating American anti-corruption laws than American companies. So that's pertinent to any company in the world, including Swedish.
Thank you. What do you say, Minister? Does Sweden have reason to be proud? Or what problems do you see in terms of corruption? What problems are the most urgent to tackle, would you say?
Well, of course we have reason to be proud. Why should I say something else when we see the ranking list all the time? Every year when these evaluations are coming, we see that Sweden, along with the other Nordic countries, actually, is very highly ranked. I think then we ask ourselves, well, how come that we year after year make these quite good results? I think it's two things. Both one thing is about the strength of the public sector in Sweden, and then number two is the legislation that we've had for a very long time. Just making a couple of examples about how Sweden, since decades or hundreds of years actually, has had a strong legislation on public access to documents, transparency in our public sector, which means that it's easier to find any wrongdoings, and that any wrongdoings are coming out in public. I mean, we've had our legislation on this since 1766, when we established the principle of public access to documents. I think that long tradition is very important. Number two, and connected to that, is also that we for a very long time have had strong whistleblower protection in our constitution, saying that if you're working in the public sector, then you are able to speak to the media if you see some wrongdoings, that something is not quite right. And you have the right to be anonymous. And not only that, the police and prosecutors afterwards, authorities, are not allowed to search for the source. That is, you are protected under the Constitution to make to blow the whistle, so to speak, in this sense. And number third is that we also have, since very long time, strong culture within our public sector, speaking about the civil servants. Culture and tradition, making it our civil servants, I'd say, very. They are hard to influence if you are going to try to do that. And Swedish companies are taught in that tradition since decades and hundreds of years that it is very. You shouldn't even try to bribe a Swedish civil servant. Then I think one should also look upon one thing here, and that is, as I was mentioning in the beginning, that if you see the countries that are ranked highest, it is the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, that comes back year after year. And someone should write an essay about that. How come that these countries that has the largest public sector, the highest taxes, how come that these countries are also the countries that actually are being best on fighting corruption? I think maybe it has something to do that having a large public sector, having high taxes, also means that you have quite big financial muscles within the public sector to prevent this. Then you asked about, well, we have a situation where we are roughly quite good at this, other than any threats. Well, I think I can point out three things that is a bit worrying. Number one is the establishment of organized crime in Sweden. We haven't, I mean, going back a couple of decades, that wasn't a big issue. But since 20 or 25 years ago, we've had a development in Sweden with more and more organized crime. And of course, they are, these gangs or these structures are trying to get into different areas, construction work, for instance, or other areas in the private sector. And then they're also trying to influence decisions taken by the public sector. So that's one big thing. Number two, connected to that, is also the privatization of the public sector. When you have more and more money going out, you have to buy, for instance, elderly care or other things, buying on an open market. Of course, that also means that you open up for if there are unserious actors trying to influence these decisions, they're going to take that. And number three, which is also a big concern of mine, and it's very connected to the United States, and that is that we have more and more money in politics. Money trying to influence individual politicians. Running their private companies, giving money to individual politicians in order to run their campaign and so on. And that means also a big risk of in the long run that they are binding up these politicians. So these three things: organized crime, the privatization of the public sector, and more money going into politics in different areas. That's three threats that I'd like to point out.
Well, if we start with the good examples and take the problems a bit later, as you noted, the 250th anniversary of the Freedom of the Press Act will be celebrated next year. What do you say, Ambassador? Is transparency in the public sector, which follows from a long tradition in this field, a key issue for not having a corrupt public sector, you would say?
I think that is because the example is set in part by government. Transparency in government is an incredibly important place to start. And I love some of the e-government examples that I have seen in Sweden. And quite frankly, I'm incredibly proud to be part of administration that has completely opened up the logs and put on the internet who's visiting the White House, for what purpose, and who's visiting Congress, and for what purpose. So these transparency in government and the intentions of those engaging with government, I think, is part and parcel of building out trust in governments, which is the essence of the democracies for which we're both trying to advance. I will also say this, though, and that's actually two things. One, messaging, even teaching from the platform of leadership regarding what is at stake is incredibly important for the world. Because if it's just America and Sweden in the fighting against corruption, we're not going to win. It has to encapsulate the rest of the world. And I'm incredibly proud that President Obama has pursued, for example, a table specifically at the G20 of the different tables of conversations and engagements under the G20. There's now one focusing on anti-corruption. in his different annual statements at the UN General Assembly, President Obama has specifically invoked the global war on corruption as a way of protecting the most defenseless. So messaging at the top and teaching people what is at stake in the global fight against corruption is one piece. But another critical piece is accountability and responsibility. And that's where the Ministries of Justice and the Department of Justice in the United States comes into place. Because there's nothing like personal responsibility to focus the mind. And what we've seen in the United States in the last 5 years is an uptick in enforcement in anti-bribery prosecutions. From like 5 to 10 years ago, there'd be about 5 to 10 prosecutions each year for violations of our anti-bribery law, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Today, there's more than 250 investigations underway. The FBI, the Department of Justice have beefed up their ranks, and the Securities and Exchange Commission have had their ranks beefed up for the records-keeping provisions of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is an important way to go after corrupt companies. But these tactics are a way of focusing the mind of senior executives, and I'll simply point out two of them. One, we've seen more and more investigations and prosecutions of American and foreign companies, and especially of their senior executives, their CEOs, their CFOs, and for acts committed by foreign consultants and foreign salespeople. That's a big change. In the past, when the Department of Justice would come knocking on your door and say, please preserve all emails, we're going to do an investigation on FCPA, one of the initial responses from a company is, oh, that's just the foreign salespeople. That's just the foreign consultants in China or Brazil. We wish they wouldn't do that. Well, these days, you better believe you wish they wouldn't do that, because senior executives are liable and prosecuted, and all of a sudden, everyone is really interested in what the foreign consultants and salespeople are doing. Second, and it goes to what the minister talked about, whistleblowers, and you were talking about whistleblowers in Sweden. I'll talk about whistleblowers in the United States. Under the Dodd-Frank Act, the whistleblowers who are reporting on corruption in companies are rewarded with a percentage of the settlement of the fine of the company. And some of these settlements and fines are millions of dollars. Whistleblowers can remain anonymous, and they can do their whistleblowing through an attorney as a way of making sure that they're anonymous. And they can collect up to 10% of the recovery of a settlement and a fine. So if you have a $100 million fine, that's $10 million. All of a sudden, a recently fired employee is extremely interested in picking up the phone and calling, and they're doing that. And there's a special hotline set up at the SEC. This has created buzz around the world. Businesses understand this, and that, if you ask me, has had a greater impact than many things in the global fight against corruption.
As you said, this is a global problem. Would you say that, but to the question to both of you, do we have the international legal infrastructure in place that is needed for this battle?
Well, to be frank, I don't think that's the main problem here.
No?
I think the main problem is that a lot of countries doesn't take after the best practices in other countries.
Yeah. The lack of implementation.
Yes, but also, I mean, if we have a group of countries that are quite good at this, then other countries should look at them on these countries and say, well, let's implement the legislation that they have. All countries, of course, should have strong legislation on public transparency. All countries should have strong legislations on whistleblower function, and not just because what you were talking about was whistleblowers inside the companies. What I was talking about was whistleblowers inside the public sector. I mean, we have to go after the companies who are doing this, but we also have to go after individuals and structures within the public sector who are open to corruption in some aspects, or the risk for, and that's how our whistleblower function works. On the Swedish thing that we should strengthen. I think we should look at our legislation about how the company fine legislation, which now is a maximum of 10 million Swedish krona. I think that's we have to look on that to raise that. We have now opened up an inquiry about that. We made a decision about that this spring to see how this should function. But my main point here is that I think the solution mainly is within the individual states.
Most of these problems occur in other countries. The alleged offense is taking place someone out there. And we have, in principle, in this country, a system with dual criminality standard. Is that a problem, or do we have to extend our rules on jurisdiction?
I'd like, of course, I can look at that also, but actually, I haven't seen the practical problems with that so far.
Probably not.
But let me have a look see if we can find if there is any practical problem with that principle. But so far, no.
What do you say, about the legal infrastructure internationally?
Well, it's inadequate.
Do we have that in place?
Well, it's inadequate, and I think Sweden has an excellent record, and the United States now is upticking prosecution in a way that has seized the minds of the business community that seeks to do business with the United States and in the United States, but it's not enough. And so what I am particularly kind of interested in highlighting for this particular crowd is an effort underway now by the United States to go after not just bribe makers, like I discussed before, but bribe takers.
Right.
And the United States has set up something, and a division within the Department of Justice called very appropriately the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative. And I think that already tells you a lot. And what it is doing is it is seeking within the jurisdiction of the United States assets stolen through corruption by foreign leaders from their own people that have been placed in the United States. And it's our assets forfeiture and assets seizure laws historically used to go after narcotics traffickers and organized crime are now being used to go after the proceeds stolen from the people of foreign countries by corrupt leaders and placed in the United States. Take Equatorial New Guinea, for example. There was recently asset seizures of a home in Maryland and a bank account. And there are other examples as well. And it lets it be known, and this was a minister in that country who was the son of the president. I mean, it's such a bad story. And I think through narratives like that, you begin to send the message around the world that do not use the United States as a money laundering facility for your stolen proceeds. And what I love is that the look back, in other words, the events of corruption that our Department of Justice and that our FBI is going after is not just like last year or 2 years ago because somehow people changed their culture when it comes to corruption. We are looking back 20 years because the statute of limitations for the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is 5 years, but if you tack on a conspiracy charge, and corruption is almost always a conspiracy, the statute of limitations extends to 20 years. And all of a sudden, people are asking, geez, was I on that email chain 10 years ago? because if you were, it's not a good thing. And I think those are the kinds of changes in posture that are gradually building the case to foreign governments that we are serious about this.
Wasn't one of your presidents the son of another president?
Yes, but we have very transparent disclosure laws when it comes to campaign finance.
Yeah,
Not every country has that. And I'll leave it at that.
The last week, We have seen a very interesting cooperation between the American authorities and the authorities in Swiss authorities in the FIFA case. Is that something that flows from the U.S. laws on jurisdiction, or could you explain to us?
You know, I took a look at the complaint that was originally published with that investigation, and so I did not actually. So I'm not an expert on that case,
Yeah.
nor do I know that much about that case. But I took a look at the complaint, and I think that they're using different laws, including mail fraud and other laws,
Okay.
to go after corruption there versus the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Okay.
Again, I have not completely read every document pertaining to that investigation, but because I'm interested in this, I went to the PDF. That if you can go to the New York Times story, there's a PDF of the actual complaint put into the DOJ. And I did not actually see the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, invoked as a method for prosecution. But again, it could be.
Okay.
So I don't think it's the example, at least for me, to talk about here.
Okay. You mentioned, Minister, criminal liability in relation to legal persons. What do you see as the problem? Is the fines too low, or are the conditions? Should the conditions be amended, or what do you see as the major development?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think the company fine that you can be sentenced to is on the low side, I'd say, and I think we have to also restructure that. I think so making it easier should be a better connection between how big the company is and how much you can be fined. That's why we have that new inquiry on the whole system. Coming back to what we just mentioned, also about and when I took up in the beginning about the political parties, as you said, I think that we must learn from each other in different aspects. I think in Sweden we have a lot of things that can be picked up by other countries when coming to how the public sector works, how we monitor it, how the whistleblower function works, the possibility for people to be anonymous and protected if their bosses is reading the newspaper that someone has leaked about what is going on within their authorities. I think we have very good examples there. But I think the United States has been far ahead of us in discussing and having restriction and transparency on how much money goes into politics, which I started with. I think that's we just the other year got a legislation on that. We're not finished with that. We still haven't. There is still a discussion about anonymous contributors, but I think that in the long run is a very tough. It's very challenging for us. And I say also in the United States, you also are facing that more and more. You had your Supreme Court opening up for super PACs just the other year, making companies go in with a lot of money to finance campaigns. And how do we know afterwards when a senator or a congressman is bound up by this money? And I'm afraid of a situation of a development in Sweden. So in a much smaller scale, of course, but still there is always that problem. But you've been ahead of us in creating restrictions and transparency on that. I think very good.
Could you see differences in the view on private contributions to
Well,
political parties?
I'm really pleased that the minister brought that up, because I do think, and I will simply refer to President Obama when it comes to the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, that there is a sense that certainly has not advanced our democracy. But I come from a country where if I could take that laptop right there, and I could put any American's or anyone's name in that laptop, I could tell you in 90 seconds what candidate they've ever contributed to, ever, how much they gave, at what event, and I could do that if they were hired as a lobbyist under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which is called the LDA, kind of referred to as the LDA in Washington, where every lobbyist has to report quarterly, not annually, but once every 3 months. Who they lobby for, what they're doing, how many meetings they had, even with the lowest level staffer or secretary. And it's not just the senator or the congressman. It can be the intern or the secretary in the office. It is a contact with a public office meant to influence on a paid basis, and that's relevant. And equally important, and I think this is also important for Sweden, which is such an international country with so many foreign actors involved in it, we have something called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, where it is any paid representation of a foreign government or a foreign newspaper or a foreign think tank or any kind of foreign entity that is cloaked in some way but meant to influence the policy of the United States has to be reported, and there's a special office within the Department of Justice that manages this, and it's enforced by the FBI. And you cross that at your peril. And there's more and more public corruption events. The bottom line is that if you put money into the federal election system in America and you don't report it, you're engaged in public corruption. You'll be prosecuted vigorously with the full weight of the United States against you, and that's an extremely bad position to be in.
Is that a development that you would like to see here in Sweden too, Minister?
We have the full United States behind any corruption in Sweden, yeah. But we can use of course, we should have a much more transparent system also coming to, as I said, money goes into politics. And the more, what I'm seeing in Sweden also is the more we get individuals electorships in Sweden, the more the risk increases. I mean, our tradition is built on parties, which parties have a certain structure. We have money coming from the municipalities, from the state financing our parties. But when we have a situation where we have more and more individuals running for their own, collecting money for their own campaigns, we simply have to have a transparency on that. Not just on the central level, we must have it on the regional level and on the local level also. I mean, running for a municipality and then on the same time getting money for a big construction company in the municipality. That's the risk of a big of corruption, of course, if you should be the chairman of the board who is then afterwards deciding who is going to build where. So we need better transparency. And so far we just have that on the state level. We have an inquiry looking into having the legislation also on the regional level and on the local level, and having a clear restriction on anonymous contributions. And as I said, you've been way ahead of us there, and we've just had this legislation for a couple of years. But now, doing this, I think in a couple of years, then in the next election, we will have a more full-covered legislation on that.
The minister mentioned the threat from international organized crime in this area. What would you say, Ambassador? Do you agree on this, that international organized crime is a major factor when it comes to creating risks of corruption?
Absolutely. And not just international organized crime, but domestic organized crime. And that's why we have RICO, which is our racketeering and organized crime statute, to go after basically business organizations created to commit criminal events. But that doesn't mean that we don't have our struggles. I think the mortgage crisis of just a couple of years ago is still being talked about as great, gross misuse of our system. We have governors who have gone to jail or are going to jail because of public corruption, members of Congress, and so forth and so on. So we absolutely have our struggles. I would say, though, that we are now entering an age where it's more easy to investigate people forensically using computers and forensic investigations using IT to find out who's doing what around the world. In other words, what happens in Western China doesn't stay in Western China anymore. And if you are thinking that it's going to be kept quiet there, it is so much more easy now to investigate who did what payments and for what. And what can happen is that an investigation of an entire industry is then kicked off. What's an example of that? Well, a couple of years ago, several pharmaceutical companies came under the spotlight and the microscope of the Department of Justice for doing bribery overseas to get medical products, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices prescribed or sold in overseas state-run medical systems in violation of our anti-bribery statutes. And so the Department of Justice put the entire U.S. pharmaceutical industry under the spotlight to find out who's doing what and how are we going to prosecute malfeasance. And that focused the mind of the pharmaceutical industry like nothing else. And there was a real coalescing of the leaders there saying, hey, we are losing a heck of a lot of money because of this. How are we as an industry going to get this right? The defense industry is a good example of where we have also undertaken heavy scrutiny, and therefore compliance programs have been put in place. There are other examples as well. And there's even, small but high-profile things that have been done that captured the attention. For example, there was a couple that was convicted of violating U.S. bribery laws for influencing Thailand's film festival and bribing their Ministry of Culture to get certain films that obviously they're associated with involved in the Thailand Film Festival. We've had sting operations where FBI agents posing as foreign officials received bribes from those who are then subsequently arrested and prosecuted for bribery. So there's lots of different takes being taken to send the message that we are as serious as a heart attack about this.
Let's turn to questions on prevention. We have heard earlier this morning about the importance of working with shared values in the companies and preventive measures of different characters. And we have at the institute, which I'm chairman of, the Anti-Corruption Institute, developed a code of standards for the companies. What's the importance of these kind of measures to self-regulating mechanisms and dealing with the common values in the companies and so on? What do you say about that, Minister?
Well, of course, it's extremely important, and I think the industry, everybody knows that this also lies in the interest of the private sector. Because what corruption really does is that it makes the companies who doesn't follow the rules, they get the contracts, but the companies who does follow the rules, well, they are losing money on that. So it's changing the whole situation of competition between companies. So I think it's what has happened now with the new regulations on this. I think it's very, very important. On the other hand, there has to be also legal measures to back that up. And as I said, we have a quite strong legislation now, but and we strengthened it the other year, where we changed our legislation. For instance, nowadays saying that it's not just about being safe, making sure that your own company is not doing anything to bribe somebody else. You also have to make sure that the agent, someone who is representing your company, agent for a company, you have to make sure that he or she also is following the rules. Otherwise, you can be sentenced yourself, or the company, the main company, so to speak. So we widened that legislation. I think that's also a strong message.
Do you agree on that the self-regulating mechanism is important in this field?
Well, I think that at this point in America, regardless as to your moral stance about America's anti-bribery rules and whether the United States has the moral right to chase corruption around the world extraterritorially, people make that argument. You would have to conclude, if you're an American business person or a business person operating within America's jurisdiction, that it is an extremely bad business decision to be associated with corruption because the fines and settlements and the terms of jail are so high. Who on earth would want to be part of that? And so I say that as the outset. And so what is the practical result of that being a business decision? What we are seeing now is a distinction made by the US government on what is a authentic, fully implemented compliance program within a large multinational, for example, and what is just kind of window dressing. And that they've heard that the US is going after corruption, so they need to get a compliance program and put that on the books as well, and it's put in your annual statement or your annual report as a company. That's no longer enough. And if that's shown to be the case, you'll be fully prosecuted for corruption, even if you had a compliance program, because it wasn't authentic. And it's clear that you were trying to hide something. And so I think that that's a very important point. I will also say this, and this I think has also done a lot to proliferate the culture and philosophy against bribery and corruption, at least as it's connected to the United States around the world, and that is this, that in mergers and acquisition, if a company subject to American legal jurisdiction acquires a foreign company that even in the past has bad acts, has a history of bribing and corruption, that acquirer acquires the legal liability of that acquiree. So part of your due diligence, this is very technical, but it's also very real. If you are a Swedish company listed on an American stock exchange, acquiring a company in China that has a history of public corruption, and you do your due diligence, or you don't do your due diligence and just buy it, and they have a history of corruption, well, you are now subject to the full force of America's anti-bribery rules. That has forced people involved in M&A to think through how on earth, when we go to any country in the world, do we root out any kind of history of corruption? And it makes them ask hard questions that no one ever asked before. No one ever asked, the company that was being acquired, what exactly went on in that quarterly meeting with the regional Communist Party official that has to happen with companies in that country. Those are the kinds of things that I think over time will make a difference, but it will take time. And it would be better if others joined us.
Well, it's a fact that questions concerning corruption has been discussed a lot the recent years, domestically and internationally. To finalize this seminar in a positive atmosphere, would you say that, hopefully, would you say that these discussions and this focus on questions on corruption have had a real and effective impact on the acknowledgement and the attitudes towards corruption? What do you say, Minister?
Of course. The more we discuss this, the more things are coming up to the surface, and the more people are also ready to speak out and if they see things, ready to allow to go public on that and to reveal it. So. Well, we're going to do what we can in Sweden to keep up with that, the best 4 or 5 in that ranking list. But as I said, there are things that we have to do. We have to see the organized crime, we have to see the money in politics, and we have to see what is now going on in different areas. But we're going to keep up our place there in the top 5.
Yes, please.
I'll close by saying, and this refers to your institute, I love that some of the best minds in the world are focusing on how to combat corruption around the world. For example, there's a new institute at Harvard focused on thinking through what actually works in the global war against bribery. On the business side, on the government side, the OECD is increasingly imposing various layers of review. the World Bank, the United Nations, and others. And so there's a lot of thinking going on in this area. But speaking very practically, to me, the best thing to report to you as an American is that in the American business context, and we have a globally oriented American business context, if anyone mentions to you in an acquisition, or when you're trying to do a foreign sales, or when you're trying to do a foreign purchase, that you know the Minister of Culture or the Minister of Interior, and you can get it done because there's a gift giving going on, you would be crazy to be associated with it. Crazy. And I think, unfortunately, that stark imprint on the mindset does more to change things than most other things, but that is the case.
Thank you so much. And thank you for those last positive words. I think those words are very encouraging for the organizers of this day of seminars. So thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you.